I don't think we're going to go as late as 4:30, but it'll depend on our questions. So why don't we turn it over to you? I see you've got the presentation up and it is on our committee page.
Thanks, Chair Durfee. Thanks, members of the committee. Oliver Pearson, I'm the director of the Division of Forests at the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Rec. And I'll share some information on the same theme that Professor Keaton spoke about earlier. Hopefully my information is consistent, but there's nothing contradictory here. And there may be some things that I'm repeating that Professor Keaton already shared with you. So apologies for that, should that be the case. So on this subject, I sort of wanted to start out with like the too long, didn't read summary of what I'm going to say. The big picture is FPR. We're enjoying a long-standing and productive partnership with the U.S. Forest Service. A lot of that comes under the Cooperative Forestry Act of 1978, which allows one of the deputy areas of the U.S. Forest Service, state, private, and tribal forestry, to support shared forest management objectives with states. And a lot of that comes through funding that the Forest Service provides to Vermont FPR to support the implementation of activities around those shared goals for forest management. And as I'll show you, that's an important part of our annual budget. We also, since 2017, have had a direct partnership with the Green Mountain National Forest under what's called Good Neighbor Authority. That came out of the Farm Bill from around that time. And that's actually just expanded. As they meet under the Trump administration, expanded productivity goals combined with hiring freeze, they've asked us, can we help? And I'll talk more about that later. But we support that because it's promoting active forest management, giving jobs to young people, and getting wood products out to support the forest economy. So on the subject of today's discussion, the reorganization, I sort of feel it has more cons than pros for Vermont. It's a real shift of focus to Western state issues, fire response and prevention, and productivity. That's understandable to some extent, given that there's more forests out there. Fire is arguably a bigger threat in the West and Intermountain states in the West Coast, although the incidents and threats of wildfire are increasing nationwide now. And there's more opportunity for forest management, getting products out to mills out there. But it's also aligned with who the leadership is of USDA and the Forest Service, where they come from and what their interest is. As I'm sure Professor Keaton said, there's been announced the closure of many research and development facilities nationwide, although as he also alluded, just in the last 24 hours, it seems that there might be a bit of a reversal on some of those. And I think another problem with this reorganization is that it creates more uncertainty for U.S. Forest Service employees and could lead to more departures. And I say more because 2025 is already a year of significant uncertainty and departures for U.S. Forest Service, which I'll talk about. And then some of the reorganization that the Trump administration wants to do around wildfire management could create disruption and add complexity to our response capacity. Part of the story for me is also following money. And it's as you hear the U.S. Forest Service talk about, we're making these changes for organizational efficiency and streamlining and getting the staff closer to the people and the trees. We also have to look at what the White House is requesting in terms of funding. And in both federal fiscal year 26 and federal fiscal year 27, significant amounts of the budget for research and development and state, private, and tribal forestry have been zeroed out. And I'll show you the specifics of that. Fortunately for those of us on the receiving end of those funds and believe in that work, Congress reinstated that funding in 26. We'll see about FY27. That's still a work in progress. And just kind of as a disclaimer, I did work for the U.S. Forest Service for 5 years, and I also spent some time at Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest that Professor Keaton mentioned earlier. So current state of the U.S. Forest Service, I'll be brief here. They manage 193 million acres of land. So FPR manages 360,000. They manage 193 million. So very big difference of scale. 154 forests, 20 grasslands across 43 states. They have somewhere around 30,000 employees. So the number is approximate because of so many resignations in 2025. And about 10,000 wildland firefighters. Current leadership appointed by President Trump, not a career Forest Service employee for the first time ever. Tom Schultz has a land management background at West, hence the shift of focus out there, and has worked as a lobbyist for the timber industry. And his vision, which to his credit, he's articulated, is what he calls cooperative federalism, which really means delegating work and responsibility to states, sometimes with funding attached, sometimes without. And really what I think is driving the reorganization is under Trump's second administration, the government writ large, the federal level, and the Forest Service is striving to reduce costs via staffing cuts and closures of facilities and programs to the detriment of lots of things. And then talking about the uncertainty, the Forest Service lost almost 6,000 employees in 2025. That's almost 16% of its workforce. So a year ago, I would have said they have 35,000. Now it's approximately 30,000. And I don't have exact details on this, but one of the reasons why the Green Mountain National Forest has asked us to do a partnership with them is because they seem to be under some sort of hiring freeze.
Representative O'Brien.
Oliver, what's been their budget and what are they sort of targeting to cut? Maybe we'll go into this later, but I just want.
Yeah, I will go into it.
Actually, what kind of numbers? Give us the
I'll go into that later. The budget is in the billions, and you'll see I have a slide that shows exactly what they're trying to cut in FY26. I won't jump ahead. We'll get there. So can I ask for your patience in your question? So backing up. So policy priorities. Currently, wildland fire focus, which is very appropriate given some of the issues that we've seen nationwide. California comes to mind, but also closer to home. So increasing readiness for wildland fire response and prevention. There is this changing federal approach where the Trump administration wants to move all firefighting federal lands into a Department of Interior National Wildland Fire Service. Congress hasn't made that happen yet, and so Forest Service still retains its own firefighting capacity. But if the Trump administration had their way, that would go away and everything would be within the interior. And the interior would cover both interior lands and Forest Service lands, which are under the Department of Agriculture. Timber production, clearly a priority. Trump's first day in office, he issued an executive order mandating a 25% increase in timber production and streamlining permitting. And there's benefits to that for getting product out to market. There's benefits to that for wildland fire prevention. There's also going to be some challenges and risks with that as well. Really depends on who you ask. And the Green Mountain National Forest is a very small part of contributing to that 25% increase. Rep. Nelson,
Thank you. With the mandate of the 25% increase, and of course we all know we need saw timber to build. Do we have the facilities? I know we don't have the facilities here in the Northeast are lacking.
Sure.
But do they have the facilities out in the Northwest? Do they have the big sawmills? I've heard a lot of the lumber we get for our big trusses are coming out of Vancouver. Because we let those facilities go in the Northwest due to not harvesting our forests.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Is there the facilities for milling? Is there also market demand for that type of increase? Because if you're not going to be able to sell the timber, cutting it has mixed benefits. So I don't really know the answer to your question. You're right. We do import a lot of softwoods from Canada. We also send unmilled softwoods out of the country regularly. And more mills have, when you bring wood to a mill, that's what they're storing in containers on site until they can ship it somewhere, and is what they're actually milling on site, which is problematic in my opinion. I think the administration's vision is tariffs could eventually, if you sort of take this leap of faith, lead to increased manufacturing capacity in the continental US. And if you increase productivity, there's your supply combined with the tariffs and strategic investments, which I think are lacking in manufacturing, to create that virtuous cycle. Not happening yet from what I've seen and read.
Who would want to invest into a modern sawmill that would cost tens of millions of dollars to build, not knowing what the next administration is going to do to our largest block of timberland ready to go? I know there's a lot of private owned timberland out there, but this tariff thing isn't helping either side of the border.
I agree. I think I might treat that as a rhetorical question because I don't have an easy answer. We've seen more mill closures in the last 5 years in Vermont than we've seen mills starting, and those that have started are very niche and specialized. And the uncertainty created by tariffs, impacts on interest rates, housing construction slowdowns, is more of a negative impact on markets and those in the wood industry than any tariff regime could create benefits that could sort of spur additional industrial and processing facilities. So I don't think this strategy is bearing fruit yet. It might not. I'll just continue going down the list of policy priorities. Organizational efficiency. I think Professor Keaton alluded to some of this reduction in costs and staff and restructuring, maintenance costs. I think some of that is as Professor Keaton said, a red herring, because many of the sites that they're planning on closing don't have significant overhead costs, if you will. Some of them do, but some of them could be handled by partners or just don't exist. Policy as sort of now in law with the big beautiful bill, which sort of is in line with the administration's goals. Funding rescission, anything that wasn't allocated, is gone, and then mandatory timber harvest increases on an annual basis. A piece of policy that is bipartisan and Senator Welch supported at our recommendation was the Fix Our Forests Act that would speed up management and wildland fire response and would streamline some permitting. Not everybody loves it, but on balance, we supported the Fix Our Forests Act, as did Senator Welch. That is sort of stuck in the legislative process. It's not passed or been signed into law yet. Other priorities, just increasing recreational access. I think the chief is a big fly fisherman, so he supports recreation, which is great. And then, as I mentioned, he believes in cooperative federalism. So this idea of shared stewardship with states is a strong U.S. Forest Service priority right now. So briefly on our relationship with the Forest Service in Vermont, our budget is around 14 million or so this year, and about a third of it comes from grants from the Forest Service. So we're very closely linked with them. Our partnership is governed by a 2017 State Forest Action Plan. It's going to be updated in 2030. And they provide annual core funding to us in 5 areas, which allows for us to hire positions, provide grants to partners, do innovative work, buy equipment, and supports other wildland fire response and prevention. And those 5 areas are forest health, urban and community forestry, wildland fire, stewardship on private lands, and then implementation of the State Forest Action Plan. We also bring in funding via competitive grants for things like bridges to support water quality prevention on logging jobs, $5 million forest resilience grant to help private landowners, loggers, foresters manage private forests for climate resilience, landscape scale restoration, think about like managing sugar bushes for sort of a mix of wildlife habitat and optimal sugar production, and then wood innovation grants that do things like put advanced wood heat in schools. So most of this funding, as I said, comes to us from state, private, and tribal forestry. And some of it comes to us under the Good Neighbor Authority Agreement. And I just highlight state, private, and tribal because, as you'll see in a minute, the vision that the Forest Service has for the future is that part of it goes away. And under this Good Neighbor Authority, we're now directly supporting the Green Mountain National Forest to meet their expanded productivity goals by hiring staff, implementing NEPA-approved forest management projects. That's new for us. We haven't done that before. We have 4 attempts. 2 of them started on Monday that are supporting forest management on the Green Mountain National Forest. And we're working with JFO to get a permanent limited service position created to lead that work. And that's because they want to meet productivity goals, but they can't hire staff. They have money, so they're giving the money to state to do their work for them. And that's very much in line with this cooperative federalism vision that the chief has. We're doing it because it supports the forest economy and it provides employment for young people and it supports our forest management goals. But there are mixed opinions about that within FPR. I'll leave that there. So getting to the subject, reorganization, this is a sort of fundamental operational shift for the U.S. Forest Service. I believe it's part of this Trump administration effort to reduce the federal government size and budget. I think that's what's driving this. There is this focus on extractive industries that I mentioned in wildland fire. Those both make sense if your mindset is of a Trump administration appointee, but the increase in timber production will come at the cost of some of the other things that Americans sort of cherish their national forests for. Leadership says they want to move staff closer to forests, more forests are in the West, so they're moving the headquarters from DC to Salt Lake City. And this is where you sort of get into the fundamental nature of this shift. They've had a regional office model for decades with 9 regional offices. Those are all closing, and they're moving to 15 state-based directors, which they believe will enhance direct communication with locals like us, states, and tribes. And then probably what Professor Keaton spoke about, this reorganization is accompanied by a major reduction in research development funding, staffing, and facilities, consolidating dozens of research stations into a single entity in Colorado. A week or 2 ago, they said they were going to close 57 sites. We're going to maintain 27 sites. There's a number of other sites that were still in the to be determined category. As Professor Keaton mentioned, they've walked that back a little bit. They've said they're going to keep Hubbard Brook in New Hampshire open, and now Bartlett in New Hampshire, and all the other 57 sites that were announced to be closed 2 weeks ago are now being considered for potential closure. And I think that's because of the significant pushback to this plan. But these changes are expected to impact thousands of positions. And as I said, there's this like center of gravity shifting to western states. What that means is there'll be less sort of focus on the dynamics of the northern forest ecosystem, northern hardwood forest. And as we struggle with things like climate change, fire, invasive species, there won't be as much focus on our forest because of this shift out west. And that'll just put more pressure on universities to try to fill that gap with less funding and fewer colleagues at the Forest Service.
Oliver, the 9 existing regional offices, where are in the Northeast, where are they?
So the Northeast region has been 20 states headquartered in Minnesota, covering those lake states in the Northeast. I have a map of that I'll show
Okay.
in a sec.
Can I just ask a question? Oliver, this is all really great information, but, and this may be for you, or it could be for Professor Keaton. But this whole focus, the propaganda was all these wildfires were a result of failure to manage. And it was all this fuel, this undergrowth of fuel. Is that helped by expanding harvest, or what is that doing for fire suppression? And is there any indication that there are 25% increase? We're talking the Doug fir and the lodgepole pine and all those coniferous, the dominant coniferous forests out west. I
think the answer is it depends. You know these forests we have in the Northeast very well. And I would argue that there probably is not a direct correlation between lots of additional management and a reduction in wildfire risk in our forests because of the amount of humidity, the amount of vegetation, how our forests regenerate. And there's probably more arid forest ecosystems out west where reducing fuel may have some benefits to reducing the intensity of wildfire. And if you think about a managed stand that's been thinned and has a stocking level somewhere around the beeline, that may be less susceptible to fire than a stand that's never been managed and has 20-year-old trees that are extremely dense. And a drought comes, or just a dry ecosystem, and that's the kind of forest that fire could really sweep through. I think the answer is it depends, and probably a fire ecologist can give you a much better answer than that. But it is part of the U.S. Forest Service argument that additional management will reduce wildland fire risk. And I think for every person who says that, there's someone else who says, well, the data isn't that clear. Here's some exceptions to that.
Let's go back 115 years to 1911 or 1909. From Kalispell, Montana over to Coeur d'Alene is the most catastrophic forest fire in American history. And that was being actively managed by private interests without any sense of science, and there was so much fuel, it changed global temperatures in North America.
Yeah, so I think
the region.
people will point to that and say that's an example of where, despite management, you still had catastrophic wildfire. So where does this connection really exist?
Yeah, I mean, to Dr. Keaton or Professor Keaton's point, is this science is critical to develop telepolicy.
So this is just hot off the presses today. I was sent this. This is a screenshot. I have a colleague at the National Association of State Foresters in DC. This is the current proposal for what the Forest Service is going to look like. So you see, there's no more state, private, and tribal forestry that's been replaced by, it used to be its own deputy area, 3 in the Forest Service. And now there's just a director for cooperative forestry under a field operations division. So they're really de-emphasizing that. And then you see there's these 15 state directors, and we're down here for the director for the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast. And then, so this is really where everything that used to be Research and development, you can see they have a director there. That was one deputy area, cooperative forestry, and the National Forest System are all kind of rolled into this one unit called field operations. That, in my opinion, really de-emphasizes both research and development and working with states and private entities. Yeah, so, and this is what, so I think to your question, we used to be Region 9 of the Forest Service, which was all these 20 states here. Now Vermont would be under the Northeast region, which would be headquartered in Warren, Pennsylvania. And it's essentially a shift from us governed by a region of 20 states to us part of a state directorate of 9 states. So that's not really a big significant change, in my opinion. I think, and it shows that, you know, while states like Arizona, New Mexico, Montana have their own state director, they're just lumping 13 northeastern states together, despite a significant amount of national forests in West Virginia, Vermont, New Hampshire, Ohio. So again, it's sort of showing that, you know, what they're really interested in, where they're allocating staff is in the western states, and they're sort of lumping these other parts of the country together.
You think they struggle making our map like we did our school maps?
Looks pretty similar.
But to me, you know, operationally, as long as there's people I can work with in Warren, Pennsylvania, that's not that different than today working with people in Milwaukee. I think what's more troubling is this lack of clarity of how state support will be provided. So today I'm seeing for the first time, there's going to be a director of cooperative forestry who I think will work with states. But up until that's, I just learned that today, and that's still work in progress.
Arizona and New Mexico each have their own.
In California, and Oregon, and
Montana,
Washington, and Montana, and Idaho.
Utah.
I can understand the Northwest, the amount of timber they have. And California with those redwoods, but Arizona and New Mexico. Utah and, I mean.
And Arizona is the White River National Forest. And I think
Some
some
of
of
the-
the Apaches ferocious.
Well, that's where those big elk come from. I mean,
Someone could probably spit out numbers of units and acres and why it makes sense for these big states to have their own directorate. So I think this just shows that's where the area of focus is. And I was sort of looking at the eastern half of the US as, you know, these areas where things can just be lumped together, which may or may not affect our relationship with the Forest Service.
Well, George Clough in his forest the other day.
I think,
I don't even have it for.
getting into the research and development question, so up until recently, we thought they were going to have 20 sites retained, only one in New England and Durham, New Hampshire, 57 being closed, including the Aiken Research Lab in Burlington, the Bartlett, New Hampshire Experimental Forest, and the Westfield, Mass Research Facility, and then a number of others, including Hubbard Brook, were on a to be determined list. So now we know that Hubbard Brook is going to be kept open, which is incredibly good news. And Bartlett, as Professor Keene says, is now being reconsidered. So some progress because of advocacy, which I'll talk about in a sec. So this may repeat a lot of what Professor Keaton said, but some of the impacts of these research and development closures, we believe that, you know, Forest Service really excels at long-term place-based research. It's very applied. We use it to serve us as natural resource managers. And this reorganization will essentially dismantle a highly functioning science program and reduce the ability of the Forest Service to provide data and information to states to effectively manage natural resources. And as has been said, we look at studies coming out of Hubbard Brook and Bartlett all the time to guide us in our decisions about land management. And things like, I mean, our UVA standards and our management approach for planting timber harvests on state lands are informed by research. And then really critical is our best set of data for what's happening with forests statewide is the U.S. Forest Service FIA program, Forest Inventory and Analysis. That's being maintained, but it's already operating on a shoestring budget. They've already gone from visiting every plot in Vermont once every 5 years to now only once every 7 years. Now they're cutting that by another third. So that's just going to reduce the accuracy and the utility of that data set, which we rely on for forestry. And someone asked me, how much forest cover is in Vermont and what's happening? I just pull up the FIA data. So that's upsetting. And as I said, most of what we know about forest management dynamics comes from the U.S. Forest Service research and development. Not to belittle the role that universities play as well, but this information is applied and it's produced in a way that's a state forester who's not an academic can digest and use. So things like acid rain, deforestation, nutrient runoff come from Hubbard Brook. A lot of the studies on silviculture, forest management, and protecting the forest ecology come from Bartlett in New Hampshire, again, for the Northern Hardwood forest ecosystem. And some of the advancements of what's happening with climate change and regeneration and how forests sequester carbon are also coming from those experimental forests. So there's going to be over 6,000 Forest Service employees impacted by these proposed facility closures, 2,700 then in research. That doesn't mean that they're all going to quit, but they may have to relocate if they want to keep their job. And we already lost 25% of the PhDs in the Forest Service in 2025, the layoffs there. So this is not a great trend. And I won't dwell on this last point. I think Professor Keaton covered it real well. So what's being done? There's some good news here. 82% of the public comments about the organization were negative. There's been strong pushback from elected leadership nationwide and all the state forests, which are 150. There's been suggestions that Forest Service should explore partnerships to reduce costs, if that's one of the main motivations to close these sites. As Professor Keaton mentioned, Senator Shaheen and Governor Ayotte of New Hampshire obtained USDA commitment to keep Hubbard Brook open. And all the sites that were a week ago listed for closure have now been reversed to evaluate for possible closure. So that's good. And I would agree that advocacy is important. At the congressional level, we know that can affect funding, structure of a department or an agency is within the administration's authority, but I still think advocacy is important. I strongly endorse Professor Keaton's idea for this committee to reach out to our congressional delegation. And I'm going to DC June 8th to join a bunch of other state foresters to pound the pavement with our congressional representatives and the committee staffers to complain about your organization, express our concerns, as well as advocate for FY27 funding. So we need someone to carry a letter. You know,
Can you take Jed with you, because he's missing out on it.
happy to take Jed. He's good company. He's got to wear his red suit though, that maroon suit. I want to see that one in action. So what I also think you got to follow the money, see what's really going on here. You know, because the reorganization must be viewed in tandem with the administration's funding requests and actions. And this gets into an earlier question. So FY25 budget was passed before the election. President Trump inherited that budget, but really worked hard to rescind significant amounts of Forest Service funding. Ultimately, that wasn't successful. But they did delay a portion. It was delayed to be made available to all the recipients until July, with only 2 months left in the end of the fiscal year. It took a lot of advocacy to get the Forest Service just to release money that had already been appropriated by Congress. Now it's a whole debate within the Trump administration, who has the power of the purse. The 26 budget request essentially zeroed out state, private, tribal forestry and research and development. So this is to your question earlier, which you can see, you know, there's 23 enacted, 24 enacted, 25. We say estimated because there's a continuing resolution that year, so it's a little murky. And you can see what the president requested in his 26 budget, which zeroed out everything in research and zeroed out everything in state, private, and tribal forestry. So to bring that a little closer to home, here's the priority programs for Vermont. Forest stewardship, which is working with private landowners, state and volunteer fire assistance, which provides a lot of equipment and funding to work with the municipalities, and our own fire response efforts, urban and community forestry, these great landscape scale restoration grants, which allow us to address forest health challenges. Our data shows us that red oak and white pine are not regenerating well in the last 7 years. So we're going to apply, if they make an opportunity available, for landscape scale restoration and try to figure out what we can do to support white pine and red oak regeneration. So these landscape scale restoration grants are really important. That was zeroed out. The legacy program wasn't zeroed out. That makes funding available for forest land conservation, but it was significantly reduced. So you get the idea. That was fiscal year 26. Eventually, Congress enacted, based on a lot of advocacy and their own good decision-making levels, similar to 2024. And that was a Republican-led Congress. And so the Republican-led Congress did not agree with the Republican administration to zero out all these parts of the bill. So
I just wonder on your earlier comment, whether when money's released so late in the fiscal year, if it's not, say, allocated or spent, does it get clawed back too? So it's sort of a, you know, you've got 1 month to spend this dollar,
exactly.
we're getting it back as surplus.
that's that pocket rescission term you may have read about. And I credit Russell Vogt, who heads OMB, for being a genius to figure that one out. What happened is in Region 9, the grants and agreements people made really a Herculean effort in August and September, in the last 2 months of the fiscal year, to get those funds allocated to states and other partners. And I think most of it got allocated, and a little bit was clawed back or lost, but these people worked around the clock as they were committed. And they saw this was their chance to support the goals of the program. So we got everything we expected at the very last minute in 25. And it was late and it caused disruptions, but we got there. I will just make one other sort of point is even with the FY26 budget, the current administration leadership of the Forest Service is still finding ways to tinker with it. So the first column was what was enacted for FY26. And then there's these two costs where the leadership is removing dollars from what's been appropriated by Congress to do things that cover undefined fixed costs and to support what are called leadership decisions. So it's never a dull moment, and that's within their prerogative, but it's frustrating because with Congress, it passes the budget. We think, great, there's 37 million for urban and community forestry. That should lead to us getting our very measly scale of $300,000. Now you have to worry about a 20% reduction in those funds. That's going to impact what comes to Vermont. Maybe we'll see. Representative Bird.
In theory, this idea of cooperative federalism, would that entail, instead of, more funds going to federal forest service, that the federal government would technically send more resources to the state?
It could and it couldn't. I think, what we're seeing with FEMA, which served as part of that cooperative federalism, is states need to do more and they're on their own financially. What our experience in Vermont has been, the Forest Service, Green Mountain National Forest asked us to support forest management on the Green Mountain National Forest. They're making funds available for 2 years to get going. And then they're allowing us, if we want to keep timber sale revenue to support those positions. We haven't said yes or no to that phase. We're going to start with the 2 years where they're paying for everything and see how it goes. If there's enough NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act approved forest management projects, I think that could work. But if we have to do the whole environmental review process that's required on federal lands and that gets caught up in litigation, then the revenue stream that we were expecting could get tied up. I will say that many states out west, where Chief Schultz is from, are doing this successfully. Idaho has a 15-person team of state employees doing forest management projects on federal lands, and they're funded entirely by timber sale revenue. So it does work in other jurisdictions. Whether or not it'll work in Vermont remains to be seen.
Well, I'm going to flag that when you talked about timber sale revenue, because I know that I've heard concern just from constituents who don't often reach out to me, concerns that these cuts would lead to, combined with the mandated 25% increase, would lead to more wholesale harvesting in Vermont's forests, and that there might be somehow less oversight because of the staff cuts. So just somebody sort of seeing some headlines, maybe reading a little bit, and maybe they haven't really thought about this before, or maybe they have, because some people obviously in Vermont clearly have thought about it. So maybe this isn't the time to go into detail on that, but it would be interesting to I think it'd be interesting for the public to better understand, is that actually likely to happen here in Vermont?
And we got into this partnership because there's a significant amount of what the U.S. Forest Service calls shelf stock. Existing approved projects that have gone through the whole NEPA process, have well-designed, scientifically based forest management prescriptions that are not whole tree harvesting, that are not clear cutting, but are things like a shelter wood cut that removes certain older species, leaves the canopy intact, and has certain goals focused on wildlife habitat restoration, climate resiliency, and will not be done under poor oversight. So that's why we're entertaining and trying this partnership out. So I think it's a very valid question. And if I was sitting on the sidelines and read the headline, I'd probably ask the same question myself. But I think at least for the Green Mountain National Forest, very deliberate environmental review has been done, good silviculture, good prescriptions have been developed, and those projects can now be implemented. We're not even, and I said, when we were considering this partnership, I said, I don't want to get involved in anything with Telephone Gap because that's new and that was contentious. So we're doing older projects that are much smaller in scale than anything with Telephone Gap. So I don't think that's a particular concern in Vermont, but I understand. And the other thing is the 25% increase. that's going to range from where you are. So a forest in Colorado might increase by 40%, whereas the Green Mountain National Forest is probably going to increase by only by 5 or 10% just because of, the market demand here and the size of the forest. So I think that those numbers that you read about will be applied selectively and they'll vary by location. And if you've seen me talk about the net growth to yield ratio, which is increasing, it's over 3-to-1 right now, or net growth to harvest ratio, excuse me, I think our forests do need more management. And so if we can support that on the Green Mountain National Forest as well as on state and private lands, I think that's a good thing.
And I'm not sure if it was you who shared this at one point or somebody else in testimony that if you look at the cutting, the harvesting that takes place on our state lands and on our national lands, the public lands, and compare that with private, it's much less intense on the publicly owned land for various reasons.
Just to add context, Chairman, for Oliver, Chair Durfee had a constituent where they were promised by the Forest Service to engage with the abutter adjacent to the log landing. And the Forest Service failed to follow through on that promise to engage in whether it might be hours of operation or access. A catastrophic failure of credibility, trust. And Chair Durfee, before we were in session, he reached out to me about this. It's an unacceptable error, whether I'm abutting you and I'm a forester and I fail to let you know, engage you in the process. So Chair Durfee's asking from real lived experience. It's not telephone gap that got all the headlines with Standing Tree. It was a small operation on the Glastonbury side of it.
Other side of the Red Island state line.
But it really,
Yeah, I mean, that's,
in our world, you can't screw up. It's just like with dairy and a violation of the Clean Water Act. Stand on your head to make it right. You don't need this bad. It's not bad press. That's a really good point you made, but it's real and someone's got to be on top of that and follow through.
yeah, it's a great cautionary tale. I hope that was a one-off, and I hope the U.S. Forest Service has tried to remedy that with the landowner. But my hope is that any sale we're involved with would follow best practice around working with abutting landowners to inform them, to identify hours of operation that are within state or federal law and respective.
Representative O'Brien.
Yeah, just quickly on that Western example you just gave, I wondered if the 15 state employees who were helping to accelerate national forest cuts, did that come at the expense of 15 Forest Service employees? So they rescinded their, they add 15 state who are essentially getting funded by harvest, right?
Yeah, that took place pre-Trump 2.0. And so that took place when the Forest Service was hiring a lot. So I think what happened out there is there was just a goal to do more management. And there was this idea of cooperative federalism through these good neighbor authority agreements. So I think both were built up simultaneously. What's happened since 2025 to all kinds of probationary staff at the Forest Service and career staff who've accepted deferred resignation is probably a very different story. But my understanding is that type of partnership at the state level complemented what was happening at the federal level. It wasn't at the expense of positions.
Because I was wondering if that model might happen here where Forest Service
I think they've
go away and FPR all of a sudden says pay for it yourself, but accelerate harvest.
It's a good question. What happened with the Green Mountain National Forest in 2025, they lost some of their probationary staff because the administration looked for that easy way to get rid of people who didn't have those 2 years of experience and were easier to fire. So they certainly lost some staff. I also have been told that there is a seasonal employee hiring freeze, and that's been in place for a few years. And I don't know the specifics of if there's a full-time, permanent hiring freeze or not. I do know that the Forest Service is prioritizing these types of partnerships with states, which is why they asked us to support forest management activities on federal lands. I don't see that as coming at the expense of any jobs within the Forest Service at this particular point in time. I think I see that as them saying, our own people can contribute this much and get this much work done to meet these increased productivity goals. If we make other resources that are available now to bring in a partner like the state, we can do more. And I think that's their incentive for getting us involved.
But it's not like FBR has capacity without funding.
No, so we're using their funding to hire new people. And they're seasonal, and they're the one year-round person will be in a limited service position. And if that funding dries up, our partnership with them will sort of go back to what it is today, which is a much more limited partnership. I'll just move along quickly in the interest of time. So federal year fiscal 27, we're looking at a very similar situation. 26, President's budget again zeroes out all programs in state, private, tribal forestry and research development, except forest legacy and forest inventory and analysis. And there's some more specifics. What's notable is the fourth bullet, the forest products program, which funds timber harvest and associated partnership agreements, such as the one that we've been discussing, has a 350% increase in the president's budget. And that's how they have the funding to hire the state. And the Green Mountain National Forest has also hired the Rough Grouse Society to help them with timber sales and forest management projects as well. So they're looking at multiple partnerships. And so these partnerships under the Good Neighbor Authority are really in line with what the president's executive order said, and Congress has mandated annual timber targets up to increase under the Big Beautiful Bill. So that's why we're seeing this shift under the sort of cooperative federalism model.
Representative Voss.
Yeah, so it says there's a 350% increase in forest products investment or something like that. I mean, is the expectation that we're going to increase forest harvesting by 350%? I mean, when they say we're going to fund everything through extra timber harvesting, what are we looking at for that? Like, what level of change are they expecting if they go with what they want?
But there's two goals. There's the executive order to increase productivity by 25%. And so you need a lot more money just to meet that target. But then I'll just go back a few slides because the Big Beautiful Bill has this other articulated goal right here. From FY 26 to FY 34, U.S. forests must sell at least 250 million board feet more timber each year than it did the previous year. That's law. That's in the Big Beautiful Bill. So, that'll be met by larger forests than the Green Mountain National Forest, that's for sure. But every forest supervisor has some target that he or she needs to meet to increase timber production under both the executive order and the Big Beautiful Bill, which is not the law of the land, like it or hate it.
Thanks.
Representative Lipsky, and then I think I'm gonna, after that, this question says, let Oliver finish it because I want to try and stay on.
This is critical for American consumers. I have watched for decades great timber being loaded on ships in Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, on Asian ships that buy that wood, take it away, process it, distribute it in a global food chain, and also sell it back to us. So as far as our processing capacity in the Northwest, all of the United States is diminished. This says increase the sales by XXX, but doesn't say anything that's going to help consumers where affordable housing, where there's going to be a lowering of cost. Doesn't say anything about not exporting this stuff.
Right.
And that's been the trend for 3 or 4 decades.
And I think my colleague Catherine Servideo would say markets. Are there markets for all this additional wood? Can it be sold? And can it be sold in the U.S. to support employment, value-added processing, revenue generation at the local scale? We know in the Northeast that's difficult, and I can't speak to the rest of
To
it.
Rep. Nelson's point, gearing up these shuttered mills in Oregon and Idaho and all over.
Yeah.
There's no lender in the world.
I'm almost done. So the FY 27 budget request looks pretty similar. This is at a different scale, but you can see research zeroed out, state private and tribal forestry zeroed out. And the wildland fire stuff zeroed out because they wanted to go over to that new Department of Interior National Wildland Fire Service system. So our work in June with Congress will be to advocate that these numbers go back to levels closer to FY26 and not be zeroed out. I'll just speak briefly. So this Wildland Fire Service is a Trump administration priority. It was established in January of this year. It's an attempt to consolidate all federal wildlife management wildfire management activities within the National Wildland Fire Service within the Department of Interior. And there's pros and cons to this. And my fire team will say, it's not a horrible idea. Here's what's good about it. Here's what's bad about it. But it hasn't been fully supported by Congress yet, and it's still work in progress. And so today, there is this National Wildland Fire Service that covers DOI lands, and Forest Service still has its own 10,000 strong firefighting staff for USDA lands. And of course, they collaborate because fires cross borders. So this is still work in progress. I won't go through all these cons because I'm in the interest of time, but this is something that I think we're all looking at and studying, and we'll have to see how it plays out. So last slide. This is pretty repetitive. I think advocacy is important right now to talk about what's good and important about the work the Forest Service has been doing, how we can maintain and grow that as opposed to losing all that. There are some positive results from this advocacy with this announcement about Hubbard Brook and some of the closures being reconsidered. And I'm optimistic that our partnership with the Forest Service through state, private, and tribal forestry, which is now I think being called cooperative forestry, will persist. Thanks to Congress seeing that that's important, reinstating those fundings that have been zeroed out by the administration, and the support of really dedicated and hardworking U.S. Forest Service field staff who are our friends and colleagues. Uncertainty about the status of both research and development and state, private, and tribal forestry in terms of being zeroed out, as well as these changes in wildland fire, really creates a shaky foundation for forest management in the U.S. And so I think that those of us that are working with state organizations are anticipating a future where we're going to be more on our own. Hopefully that's not the case. I think Professor Keaton talked about funding could be reinstated. There will still be major losses of institutions, data, brains, but I think, we're hoping that this is a temporary blip, and either after the midterms or even into next administration, things sort of take a more, I would say, reasonable track. Green Mountain National Forest did lose probationary staff in 2025, but a great team remains, and we're helping them by hiring staff that can do forest management on their lands. We're grateful for that partnership we have with the Forest Service, and we're excited to implement all these U.S. Service-funded forest management projects. And so while I've been somewhat critical of the organization, we really believe in the mandate and the mission of the U.S. Forest Service, and we hope that we're able to weather this storm and come out the other side more or less intact and able to do all the great work that they do to steward our nation's forest lands. I'll stop there. Thank you for the opportunity, Chair Durfee.
And one thing that we haven't talked about it, I don't know whether it fits into the topic really, but for Vermonters who drive by and see the Forest Service headquarters in Rutland or Rochester,
Mendon.
yeah. Are those, is staffing at those been affected at all?
Been affected, but the lights are still on. There's still people working there. As I said, they lost probationary staff. The numbers were not significant. They weren't huge in 2025. So they weathered the storm pretty well. And there's still plenty of hardworking staff doing great work. And I'd encourage those Vermonters to pop in and say hello and ask questions and get to know the people that are stewarding those forests.
Other questions, thoughts? Really helpful. Thank you for putting the work into the presentation.
I think it's a bit of a moving target. It'd be interesting to come back in 2 years and give an update.
Yeah.
See where things have gone between now and then.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Yes, so thank you.
Yeah.
Professor Keaton, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.